So whenever we confront the world in data, we confront it already endowed with a certain structure and shape. So we face a world where people are aged 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, where geographic space is already partitioned into zip codes and census tracts, set apart by municipal boundaries and state lines, where opinions range from strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And every data set that we have then slices the world up in a particular way. And that slicing makes salient certain kinds of distinctions and it effaces others. And it encourages certain ways of seeing and thinking and drawing inferences and discourages other ways of seeing, thinking, and drawing inferences. And so a 33 and a 34-year-old might be scarcely different in a kind of data set structured like this. We might not even care about the difference in age, but once 34 and 35, the pair are different indeed. That same quantitative difference, right, becomes a kind of qualitative difference that seems to have apparent significance above and beyond the difference of that just that 1 year. And that difference is going to feed into whatever models or whatever inference tools that we build from these data. And more generally, the raw material from which we build any of our data tools already come in these building blocks whose shape is already set by these variables, these categories, and these category values. This is a pretty basic idea, but I think it's always helpful to return to, which is that our choice of variables, which are just these columns in a data set, don't just determine the shape that our algorithmic tools and the models take, so the character then of the outputs that they generate, they also powerfully shape the way that we think about fairness and non-discrimination of these systems. And this is because another basic point, which is that a lot of our mathematical and technical notions of fairness or unfairness or auditing these systems are conducted in a formalism that just refers to variables, right? They just refer to x's and y's and variable values. And so whether these are good technical analyses of fairness, which is a social and ethical concept, is going to depend not just on what the formalizations say, but what these x's and y's actually refer to in the world, like what these x's and y's represent. So we can kind of we can hold fixed the technical definition of what fairness is, and it'll just amount to a different notion of fairness depending on what the x refers to. So here's a really simple illustration of the point. Suppose I have a really basic kind of predictive model of your admission into some school. And I'm just going to make it super simple here, and I just have one variable of interest, or having, x that requires some facts about your academic performance, some other facts about the candidate, and then there's a prediction of an admissions outcome. And suppose I dictate that for all individuals, I, in my data set, fairness requires that for a given value of x, so for a given level of academic performance, the probability that you're going to be admitted or that you'll be predicted to be admitted will be the same. Suppose that that's what my view of what it is for an admissions procedure to be fair is. So I'm basically saying here that my algorithm is fair insofar as it's only sensitive to the measure of academic performance given in the variable x. Now I want to set aside whether you want to endorse this definition of fairness, because my point is actually the substance of what this definition even means is different depending on what we actually choose for our value of x. Does x, for instance, refer to a student's raw SAT score, maybe their SAT score by percentile, maybe their SAT score by their school district percentile? These are all really arguably reasonable choices for how you might want to capture academic performance for the purpose of determining college admissions. But for each different choice of x, it's a different substantive view of what it is for something to be fair, right? And so the idea here is just hammering down a fairness definition at this level of abstraction doesn't actually drill down on a substantive conception of fairness, right? We can agree to this definition pitched at this level of abstraction and then disagree once we actually kind of have a concretized choice of the variable x. And so argument then just at this level, where we might seem to have a superficial agreement, can actually efface serious disagreement once we fill in the particular choice of variables or once we work on a particular data set. And this is a rather kind of simple point that precedes that kind of, and it's a simple case, but it's a general point that I think shows that our conception of what it is for something to be the same, right, same academic performance, has actually not been, I think, very well articulated because we haven't actually focused in on the particular identities of various variables. And so the question here is, what does it mean for two individuals to have the same x? The preceding example here shows that what it is for two people to have the same academic performance x as measured in the raw SAT score isn't the same as the same academic performance measured as the percentile or as the same SAT score measured by the school district percentile, right? And for many people who might be familiar, a lot of this actually gets at, I think, some serious, deep disagreement in the Harvard affirmative action case about what it is to measure academic performance in that case. And you know, we can't make comments about who's better academically until we kind of settle about what it is for people to be the same academically. So the idea here then is that just saying that you need the probabilities to be the same if you have the same X papers over this vast ambiguity of what we mean when we say that we have the same academic performance X. And so it's difficult to either endorse or reject a technical definition without having already committed to a particular choice of variables and variable values. This is a really basic point again, which is that all our analyses of fairness that are spelled out only in X's and Y's are bound conceptually and normatively by what those X's and Y's refer to in the world, and by that particular way of slicing up the world that we've chosen, or more likely that we've just been given by a given data set. This is the problem kind of vagueness in our variable definition. Now, I want to start here because I think it kind of gets us into a more general problem with the talk of sameness and equality in data sets. And so I want to pivot here to a problem that comes starkly into view when we consider social categories or salient social categories or social statuses such as race or sex that I think are defined by markers of social distinction. These are markers of differentially positioned social statuses in a racially or gender stratified society. So here we're kind of saying that we have a kind of tension between definitions of categories that are defined by difference that we want to make people the same on. And the problem is this. It's an attractive and common assumption made, though oftentimes not very consciously, to think that fairness requires that two individuals who are the same in some X be treated the same, at least as far as that dimension goes. And so, there might be other reasons we might treat them differently, but as far as X goes, we should treat them the same because they're on par. So, to repeat, when two individuals have the same level of covariates or some feature value, some X in the data set, then they must be substantively the same in that dimension, right? The thought goes, so they should be treated by an algorithm as such. So when two people have the same work experience or the same educational background, a fair algorithm should treat each of these individuals' factors in the same way when determining their outcome or classification. And this idea is captured very powerfully in the audit study, and this kind of mentioned yesterday, where many economists and sociologists have put forth the audit study as a sort of gold standard of social scientific evidence of causal effects of race or sex. And I'll just go through this very quickly. The idea is you're going to present two candidates where all of the candidates are identical but for the category of interest. So here what's happening in this very famous Bertrand-Mullin-Nathan study is resumes are being sent out where the contents of the resume are identical but for the names where they're supposed to send out, or they're signaling different racial statuses. And the idea here is that any difference then we get in some outcome and some callback outcome has to be due then to the difference in race, because everything else, the idea goes, is the same. But again, this is only on a particular way of thinking about what it is for two people to be the same, right? It presupposes a particular way of slicing up the world, a particular way of choosing variables to capture contents of these resumes. So I want to probe that further. Why precisely, in a study like this, are Greg and Jamal supposedly the same? I think the idea goes like this. It's natural to code up these resumes by choosing variables that tracks the sameness in the resumes by just tracking literally the kind of letter by letter qualifications of these resumes. So just like pure descriptive facts. I'm going to code up Greg and Jamal's candidacies by choosing variables so that I can identify X1 as like their last job title, or their X2 is going to give their education history. And so then we might say that X1, X2, and X3, Greg and Jamal, are the same. They're only different in, let's say, Z, their names. So we might choose X2 to mark the GPA they had in an institution, or X3 to mark their most recent job type. Then, once we choose variables like this, it's very attractive to say, well, the disparity that results has to be due to the one variable that's different, which is Z here, which is the name, or often race, perceived race, since everything else is the same. We've been able to eliminate all the other factors. But as I've shown, variable selection is more of an art than a science. And Greg and Jamal here are only the same on this particular way of conceiving of how we should carve up their variables, how we should choose variables to represent their resumes, right? The underlying assumption here is that their difference in race is actually independent of their supposed similarities in these other features. We can separate out the fact that they're same in education, but they're different in race. Their difference in race, in other words, doesn't infect or affect at all the fact that they're the same in their education. The idea, in other words, is that you have one variable that's the race variable, and then you have the other variables that are all non-race variables. And it's because we can equalize on the non-race variable that we can isolate or disentangle just the race variable. This is the assumption that even makes it possible for us to claim that Greg and Jamal are the same but for race. So I just want to drill down on like the underlying logic of the study. But what I pointed out, I hope, up to now, is that variable choice is up to us. We could have selected a different set of variables that would just as well, just as accurately, just as objectively capture facts about the applicants, right? I could have chosen to a variable that says percentile of GPA instead of neighborhood percentile of GPA rather than raw GPA. I could have also done that. I could have said, I could have basically chosen variables that would basically blur that line between a strict race variable and a strict non-race variable. And those are just as well, just as true kind of captures of the data. If you think as I do, taken alone then, the premise that Greg and Jamal are different arrays says nothing about how we treat that difference once we construct our variables. And I think this way of carving up variables seems to think that racial status is something like wearing a hat or not wearing a hat. You can kind of wear a hat, and you can wear a pair of pants, and you can either not wear a hat and wear a pair of pants, and there's kind of a total modularity and independence between the two. But if you think that race is a marker of social distinction, social difference, and a social difference maker, then once you perceive a difference in race, you perceive social differences across many different features and not just in race. And so selecting variables like this draws a false race, non-race distinction that makes it attractive but no less nonsensical to claim that people can be different in race but identical in everything else. It is impossible to be different in a relational fact and same on everything else. I think this makes for a bad way of social theorizing and an even worse way of doing ethical theorizing. Now, let me give you an example to try to pump this intuition. Suppose I went and I tried to interpret the following resume. It's two individuals. They're identical. They both have their, bachelor degrees from UCLA, and they're different just in age. We have the person on the left who's a 12-year-old graduate of this UCLA and a 22-year-old graduate. And I think when we see something like this, we don't think, well, they have the same academic preparedness because they both graduated from UCLA with 3.7 GPAs. They have the same skills. And GPA and undergraduate institution delivers information about academic achievement. And age delivers only information about how long you've been on this earth. I think the rational, and not even necessarily the fair, I'm just saying the rational thing to do is to interpret the GPA and the institution in light of the facts about age. That is, here, what we do when we read these resumes is we think that the 12-year-old is some kind of prodigy. And this bears on how we should understand her GPA. And so I'm arguing the same for race. The qualifications here are different because of the difference in age. When we interpret these resumes, we don't think that they are identical but for age. They are substantively different in many dimensions because of their difference in age. And so the problem is that the predominant way that we've constructed variables engages in a false separation of social facts. And I think the reason is because there's a fear of a sort of value-laden interpretation of the thing that we're collecting data on. But the point is that all variable selection engages in a value-laden interpretation. And when the data are plugged into algorithmic decision systems and they're paired with fairness definitions, we can kind of take for granted that it's obvious what it means for people to be the same in X's and only different in race. And a particular way of choosing variables then implicitly endorses one way of conceiving what equality means, and all such variable choices with a distinct race variable suggests that there's facts about race on one hand, and then there's non-race facts on the other. But this is just to think that race is a column on a data set. It's a singular fact distinct and separable from all the other facts, rather than a fact about how people are situated in a world that is racially stratified. Now, in my view, what it is to be race is, in a racially stratified world like ours, is to occupy a particular position in a nexus of social relations and receive differential benefits and burdens on the basis, and different expectations and norms on the basis of that position. It's a relational fact. And that's why the kind of common refrain that audit studies are, show differences between individuals that are the same but for sex or but for race is actually false. So I want to kind of summarize this kind of 3 points on variables. The first is that variable selection partitions features into those that are race versus non-race. But this proceeds from an incorrect view, I think, of what race is, because race is not a trait of an individual, it's a social relational fact that bears on the substantive meaning and the character of many of the other variables that are recorded in a data set. And we can forget this when we forget that variable sets are constructed and selected rather than kind of naturally carve up the world. The second point is this. Fairness definitions that are formalized in X's and Y's formalize the thought that two individuals could be the same in some X's and only different in some Z and or Y. This, I think, again, as I've argued, is incoherent. Or at least in order for it to be coherent, you have to put forth a substantive analysis of what you think race is, so it's clear what you think it means for two individuals who are defined by a fact of social difference can nevertheless otherwise be the same. So how are we going to thread that needle? And the third is this. A particular selection of variables and variable values, and not just the fairness definition alone, contribute to the substantive views of what equality requires. It's not enough to just put forth a definition of fairness. You have to tell me what those variables actually refer to, because fairness is not a notion that stands between X's and Y's. It's a notion, I think, that stands between me and you, all of us. And I want to now circle back to this last point and touch on a few things that were discussed yesterday that emphasize experiments and methods that try to disentangle discriminatory or race-caused kinds of behaviors and outcomes from other causes that would explain away those disparities. Now, I want to talk now about the case of the ad targeting that Alexandra Korolova talked about with us yesterday. So we might inquire, remember, in that case, whether an ad algorithm was being discriminatory by designing an experiment that presented ads that are identical, right, that was the logic of the study, across a number of features, but different in some particular variable of interest. So in the example that we were given yesterday, we might want to make sure that the ads are here. We're testing this experiment. Is the algorithm targeting based on sex status or gender? And we're going to run an experiment where we give the two ads the same budget, right? We expose them to the same audience. We do the study at the same time. We equalize the same type of job. All we make different is let's say the company in this case. And the idea of the lot, just like in the audit study, at the commonalities, the fact that they're given the same budget, the same audience, the same timing, is supposed to eliminate these other routes and mechanisms by which the disparity could be arising so that we can disentangle and focus on the mechanism of discrimination or the mechanism of racial targeting or whatever. And so then, if a disparity yet remains, we can say that the algorithm was indeed targeting or was indeed discriminating. Right? And so here's a quote from that kind of well summarizes from the paper. Our main challenge is to isolate the role of the platform's algorithms in creating skew from the other factors that affect ad delivery that may be used to explain away any observed skew. And the emphasis here is my own. But of course, as I've just said, this kind of a statement relies on a bunch of premises about what it is for things to be other factors, separated factors in the same, and then different only along one dimension. Right? So the idea here is that when an algorithm is indeed discriminating, a good experiment should try to equalize and eliminate the other mechanisms that might be causing disparity so that we can disentangle these other mechanisms from the particular discriminatory effect that we're interested in. But this assumes, of course, that the mechanisms over here are not avenues of discrimination. Right? And this, I think, is evinced. So you might ask that, this is evinced in kind of the possible factors that could possibly explain away the skew. So Alexandra suggested yesterday, it could be that the disparity is because more men use the platform than women. It could be that the women are more expensive to reach, that the men are more engaged by the ads, that the men are more qualified by than the women. But of course, we might ask ourselves, why should these facts explain away the disparity as discriminatory? These facts can only explain away the discrimination if these facts alter what the disparity should be. So there's a conflation here oftentimes between when we say something is innocuous, which is used to describe these kinds of mechanisms, which basically is a judgment, it's a normative judgment about whether they're okay or not, and whether they're causing the skew. Those are two different things. Whether they're causing the skew is an empirical matter. Whether they're innocuous and they're non-discriminatory is a normative matter. And so when you say that the disparity is not due to discrimination, but is due to the fact that women are more expensive to reach, you're putting forth a normative statement, which is that a disparity that results when women are more expensive to reach in an ad marketplace is fair. It's a non-discriminatory way for a skew to arise. And that evidence, that a disparity that arises so, would be not evidence of discrimination. Because, I think the implicit thought goes, that relying on market pricing is a sex-neutral or a race-neutral way of determining how goods should be allocated. That is, it assumes that our determination of what the baseline racially or gender-wise fair treatment is should incorporate facts about how a market works. When we decide what the baseline fair treatment is, we should embed within it existing facts about the skew of what it takes to reach men versus women in an advertisement marketplace. That these are justified deviations from equality, right? That's the assumption here. The fact that women are more expensive than men or men are more qualified than women, those should be incorporated into what we think is fair at the baseline, and only deviations from there can we call discrimination. That baseline is fine. Discrimination is what happens on top of that baseline. This is, I think, a fine and moral political view to hold, but I think it should be made explicit. And I'm afraid that at this point, a lot of analyses of discrimination and causal effects actually don't show us that these are normative calls rather than calls about good methodology or good experimental design. And I need to wrap up here, so let me just say my kind of last point. Oh my goodness, okay. I think this is my greatest concern here about the highly technical and methodological disputes about how to properly measure causal effects of race and sex and also talk about fairness and discrimination, which is that we have fundamentally conceptual and normative questions that have to be addressed, but instead of focusing on these normative questions about what constitutes the legal and moral wrong of racial discrimination, it's been taken over by a methodological approach that actually shrinks away from engaging in the question of what it is for these categories to be causally efficacious. And I've tried to convince you today that when we try to isolate or disentangle race, sex, or discriminatory effects by looking at contrasts that are different only in race, we're doing an impossible task because these statuses cannot be different only in one thing. They are defined by relational categories defined by difference. And so all these more sophisticated ways of identifying causal estimands, of doing our methodological sparring, they do not place discrimination studies on more theoretically sound footing. And instead what we should be doing, I think, is rich and detailed descriptive work about the ways in which persons who are differentially racialized are dissimilarly situated vis-a-vis various benefits and burdens of social life. I think that would be really helpful quantitative work. And I think what we need then is honest, transparent, and clear statement about the normative positions that underwrite these studies that are given up in an empirical study, and defenses for why we should be caring about these as the cases for detecting discrimination. Now, not every empirical study has to contain extensive philosophical or legal argumentation supporting that normative theory. Obviously, I do not think that. But I think as everyone here who works in machine learning and algorithmic fairness knows, it's only when our assumptions are made explicit that we can actually have clear and open debate about the issues that we agree and disagree on. Thank you.
Wonderful.